What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here. So last week I put out a few videos showcasing the best exotic weapons in Destiny 2, so I thought it would then be fun to talk about the worst exotics in Destiny 2. This list is from a PvE perspective, so some of these weapons may be pretty good in PvP, but I want to talk about their valuability or lack thereof in PvE. So when I made this list at first, it was just based off of how bad I knew these weapons were. I literally had to pull like half these weapons from collections because they aren't even worth keeping in my vault. And then, when I went to get footage with them, I realized that some were way worse than I thought, and others were actually kinda decent. So this is my third time rewriting this script and adding different weapons and taking others off the list. I didn't want to be giving you false information after all. And another thing to note is the footage in the background was all in Legend Lost sectors where enemies are not that strong, and I had solo operative on in all the clips. So these weapons may actually look better than they really are. Like, Overload rockets can one-shot a lot of Overload champs and Legend content, but not with the rocket on this list. So with that out of the way, let's look at the list. At number 10, we have Sturm. So hear me out here. This weapon is an exotic primary, so it deals 40% more damage to red bar enemies. And it's a hand cannon, and hand cannons got a buff and feel really good in PvE now. The reason this weapon is on the list is because it's a relic of the past. It was built around a double primary weapon loadout way back at launch. The only thing this weapon really does is get a high-powered shot when you get kills with Drang, but running double primary in this day and age isn't all that great to do. So it is not that the weapon is necessarily bad, it just may be in need of an update to bring it up to today's power standards. I don't think it is worth taking up your exotic slot, and then if you want to take advantage of its exotic trait, you must run Drang in the energy slot. So that's why it's on the list. I think Thorn, Hawkmoon, and Ace of Spades all have way more viability for an exotic hand cannon in that top slot. So yeah, it's just not really worth it in today's sandbox. Next, at number 9, we have Salvation's Grip. I thought this may avoid the list thanks to the rework it got and the fact that Stasis is better this season, but it is still an awkward weapon to use for damage. Yes, it can have a place in a build based around Stasis Crystal Shatters, but the fact remains other heavy weapons can output much more damage in an easier manner and also may not take up an exotic slot to do so. It did get that rework thankfully, so now it's not totally pointless, and with Stasis set for a buff and final shape, it may be decent in the future, but right now it is very niche and almost never gets used outside of trying to go out of bounds on maps. At number 8, we have the Chaperone. Yes, I know this thing is a monster in PvP, but this is a PvE list. This weapon hits pretty hard with Roadborne active, but it is nothing that a well-rolled kinetic slug shotgun can't already do, especially something like Heritage from Deepstone Crypt. So for that reason, it lands on this list. It has an awesome ready animation and really cool style to it, but like I said, other slugs do what it does and better, and they don't have to take up your exotic slot. So for that reason, it lands on this list. At number 7, we have the Jade Rabbit. This thing is good in Crucible, but in PvE, it's basically useless. It's a slow-firing scout rifle, so really not the best archetype for today's PvE environment. If you're gonna sit back and plink away with a scout rifle, then use Polaris Lance or don't use anything at all. It got a rework a little while ago, and now it's at least usable. It used to give you more crit damage as you hit body shots, now it builds up Fate of All Fools as you land crits, and this buff lets you hit for the same body damage as crit damage. So there is at least a bit of value there, but it's certainly not enough to take up your exotic slot. And like I said, high impact scout rifles in PvE are just not that great in general. You could use a kinetic slot bow instead and be way better off. At number 6, we have Vigilance Wing. Again, a weapon that is a relic of a bygone era of Destiny. On its own, it feels pretty decent. Again, most exotic primaries feel pretty nice to use in this day and age thanks to that 40% bonus damage to red bars. But its exotic perk is basically based around your teammates dying, which is not something you want to be happening. This is definitely more geared to PvP, but in PvE, it doesn't do anything special. Something like Graviton Lance is a far better option for a PvE pulse, or Bad Juju or Outbreak Perfected if you want one in the kinetic slot. Now we reach the top 5, and this is where the weapons get especially bad. At number 5 is Deterministic Chaos. On paper, it sounds pretty good, every 4th shot weakening a target and making it volatile. But in practice, machine guns are used for ad clear, so most of the time you aren't landing 4 shots on a target. And if you are, then you probably want something much stronger than a machine gun to take it down. And say you do want to use a machine gun for champion damage, well that's fine, but a killing tally commemoration will actually out damage it if you have killing tally times 3 going. and if you want volatile and weaken like it offers, then on a void subclass, you can pretty easily weaken a high value target and get volatile rounds, and then the commemoration would really outdamage it. So yeah, it's not like this thing is absolutely terrible, but there are way better legendary machine guns, and when you compare it to another exotic machine gun like Thunderlord, it just doesn't hold up at all. Being able to weaken on command is nice, but that's about it. At 4, we have the Colony. This is a GL that shoots little tracking robots. It was good for one thing and one thing only in PvE, and that was being able to go through immunity shields on certain enemies if you shot right up close to them. Other than that, this thing is trash and not worth an exotic slot. The recent reserves buff to grenade launchers may make it a decent play as an ad clear weapon, but there are also way better ad clear weapons that don't use up your exotic slot, and it doesn't hit very hard at all on high health targets. It's a fun concept for a weapon, but not great in higher end PvE. At number 3, we have Truth. Holy shit, this rocket is bad. I originally had it ranked at like number 8, but when I went to get footage with it, I was like, wow, this weapon is garbage. It used to be a menace in PvP and Gambit because it's an exotic rocket launcher with built-in tracking. The problem though, is it has the perk grenades and horseshoes. That means it explodes when it's in proximity to the enemy, meaning we don't get impact damage. And this means this rocket hits like a thin piece of paper. It holds 3 in the mag, so it can have some okay burst DPS, but its smaller reserves make it so that it has very little total damage. It did get a reserve buff with the March 5th update to go from 7 to 9 at base, but it's still pretty brutal and does shit all for total damage. It's definitely not worth running as an exotic when things like Dragon's Breath and Galahorn exist. But back to the tracking, I tried using it in a normal lost sector to get some hard tracking shots, and it wasn't even great for that. It certainly doesn't bend as hard as it used to in D1. Don't be fooled by the background footage, it is only a legend lost sector and I have solo operative on, but overload rockets deal extra damage to overload champs. On regular champs, it doesn't hit very hard at all. Its niche is more as a PvP rocket launcher though, but yeah, don't use this thing in PvE. So before we get to the top 2, I want to give a few honorable mentions. Darcy was originally on this list, but after getting footage with it, it is decent to use on overload champs, and the reserve buff to rapid fire snipers is what kept it off this list. As a heavy exotic sniper, it needs to hit harder in my opinion, but the easy jolt it can apply gives it some utility in the right scenarios, so I decided it didn't quite make the cut. Another is Queenbreaker. If I had made this list a couple months ago, it would have been on here, but I decided to wait, and then I needed a weapon that could blind in the heavy slot for my solo Lake of Shadows GM, and Queenbreaker was my only option. It actually worked great, and I got the solo clear. Because blinding is just so good in Destiny, it actually has a very unique and valuable niche. But aside from that one small use case, it sucks. Its DPS is horrible, and it needs a damage buff badly. I also thought Heir Apparent might make this list, but I was pleasantly surprised with how hard it could hit on champions. So after getting footage with it, I had to take it off the list. This thing isn't bad at all. So with the honorable mentions out of the way, let's move on to number 2, Mida Multitool. Much like Jade Rabbit, this thing basically doesn't do anything that a regular scout rifle can't already do in PvE. It has no damage perk, and it just allows you to see your radar while ADS'd, and it also gives you a bit better movement speed. And this movement speed is increased if you're running Callus Mini Tool, or Mida Mini Tool, whatever it is now. So much like Sturm, it's based around a double primary sandbox that doesn't really exist anymore, so it's not worth the exotic slot at all. At least exotic primaries do get the 40% damage bonus to red bars, but even still, it's very much not worth running. And last but not least, we have the last word. Again, this is pretty nice in Crucible, but in PvE, it sucks. It is meant to be hip-fired, which is not ideal for dealing with enemies at range, and it only holds 8 in the mag, which is awful. Sure, you could pair it with Lucky Pants to make it at least usable, but overall, this thing should never be used in PvE. So to recap, we had Sturm at number 10, Salvation's Grip at number 9, the Chaperone at number 8, Jade Rabbit at number 7, Vigilance Wing at number 6, Deterministic Chaos at number 5, the Colony at number 4, Truth at number 3, Mida Multitool at number 2, and the Last Word at number 1. This list was definitely tricky to make. I thought I knew which weapons sucked and was pleasantly surprised by a few, and then more disappointed by others. But I think I got a good list of the worst PvE exotics in the end. What did you think of the list? Do you agree? Are there any weapons that you think should or should not be on the list? Let me know down in the comments, as I'm curious to hear your thoughts. And if you are still watching, I appreciate you. Like and subscribe for more Destiny 2 content, and take care.